This is the Modern American Dream Objective 1 Part 2 about the restricted immigration period of 1920 to 1960 and the Japanese immigration period that also happened roughly during this time. So please take a look at study guide and we'll get started with this. This political cartoon, if you see here, symbolizes the restricted immigration period that took place from 1920 to about 1960, a good 40 years, where, after the new immigration period, where the doors were open, come in as you please, everything's good like that, the restricted immigration period isn't quite that way. During the restricted immigration period, there's an average of only 100,000 immigrants per year during that time, and the situation would basically get a little bit worse. During that time, if you take a look on where it says the Emergency Quota Act, the second one down on the left there's two major quota acts if you look at the chart here. The first one deals with the average annual inflow from 1907 to 1914. And as you can see there, the immigrants are primarily, there's a huge tip toward immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe during that time. Well, the restricted immigration period essentially ends that. The Emergency Quota Act of 1921, you can see that on the left side going halfway down, limited things to 3% of each nationality. Now that was based on numbers from the 1910 census, and during the 1910 census there weren't as many immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe and Asia and things like that as there had been before. So if you limit that to 3% of each nation's population, or you limit it to 3% of the population, however you want to say it, when you limit it down to 3% from each nationality, it decidedly tips things, if you take a look here, it decidedly tips things toward the immigrants from Northern and Western Europe. Okay? Now, in 1924, they even made it a little bit worse. In 1924, they dropped it down to 2% of each nationality, and they based it on the numbers from the 1890 census, before, even before massive waves of new immigrants were coming in. Now, don't get me wrong, the new immigration period started right after the Civil War, but the biggest waves of immigration are coming around in the early 1900s to 1920. Right at the tail end of the new immigration period is when most of the immigrants of that time were really hitting the shores hard at this point. Now, the Immigration Act of 1924, like I said, basically limited immigration from Southern Europe as a whole. It was 2% of each nationality. And it completely banned all Asian immigrants. Now, this is an old political cartoon from the late 1800s, because remember, in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act had banned all Chinese immigration. But other immigrants like the Japanese, the Koreans, they were allowed to come in. The Immigration Act of 1924 banned all of them. The Chinese had been banned for a while, but now all Asian immigrants were banned by the Immigration Act of 1924. Now, that being said, the 1930s are kind of a tough time in this country in terms of the migration swings, because it's the only decade in U.S. history where more people leave than arrive. 100,000 people actually went to the Soviet Union to help Joe Stalin build communism there, because capitalism in the United States wasn't looking very good. More on that later when we study the Great Depression and the New Deal. In the 1940s, we actually start seeing a little bit of an influx of immigration, because people were fleeing Europe during the World War II era. Sorry, I had a little blip there. Again, they're fleeing Europe because Hitler is dominating Europe. He's conquering territories, and he's killing Jews any chance he gets. So a lot of them leave. Now, I want you to think about this for a second. You hop on a boat. You try to flee Europe. People like Albert Einstein fled Europe because of this reason. But a group of Jewish refugees got on a boat called the St. Louis. And over the 2-week steam or 3-week steam across the Atlantic Ocean, with every passing wave, I want you to really think about this. They believe that they are leaving death and they're going to live. And think about how much of a relief that would be. Well, they get over to the Western Hemisphere, and there were so many immigrants coming in during this time. They tried Cuba first. That didn't work. They weren't allowed in Cuba. And then they go to the United States. And the basic idea in the United States was that, they wouldn't be let down. This was the land of opportunity. This was the land of freedom. And so they got to the dock at Miami, but they weren't allowed off the boat. They had to get permission to seek asylum in the U.S. Well, that didn't really work. Franklin Roosevelt was trying to maintain immigration policies during the restricted immigration period, and so the people of the St. Louis were not allowed to step on the mainland. Panicked, they took off for Canada to see if the Canadians would let them in, and the Canadians didn't do that either because they were worried that they were going to go across the United States-Canadian border into the U.S. So at that point, people start jumping off the boat and killing themselves because they don't want to go back to Europe. Well, they didn't have any choice, and eventually the people of the St. Louis sailed back to Europe with every passing wave now telling them that they are on their way to die. And once they got back to Europe, the British took many of them in, and the British were never conquered by Hitler, so that was okay, but at least 2/3 of the immigrants on the St. Louis have ended up in Nazi death camps and died during World War II. The Japanese also had their challenges and the experiences they were trying to have in America. The Japanese had actually started coming to America in the late 1800s, and by 1924, by the time of the Immigration Act of 1924, which basically ended all Asian immigration, there were already 380,000 Japanese who had migrated here. Those who had migrated here were called Issei, or the first, Japanese immigrants who were born in Japan. Their kids who were born in the United States were called Nisei, which is Japanese for second. I don't know if I'm totally saying that right, but that's basically what it is. Now, the Japanese were better educated and wealthier than most of the immigrants at the time. The original ones that came over, the Japanese government encouraged their settlement here and felt that they needed to be educated and wealthier. And many Issei eventually go to college and encourage their children to learn English, excel in school, and go to college. Most of them originally only expected to stay temporarily. The usual plan was to make a lot of money in the United States because the wages are so much better, and then with their profits go back to Japan to buy some land. Now, as it turned out, a lot of them typically worked on Hawaii sugarcane or Hawaiian sugarcane plantations, or they'd go to a fish, fruit, or vegetable cannery on the mainland. Meanwhile, some others became some of the most prominent farmers in California. Eventually, they got to the point where they were producing, Japanese farmers were producing 70% of California's strawberries, 95% of the snap peas, and over 50% of the tomatoes by 1940. There was even one guy who got the nickname of the Potato King and sent his kids to Harvard and Stanford, finally passing away in 1926 with a $15 million estate to his name. So the Japanese were doing pretty well. And a lot of Japanese women were making their way over here. If they weren't making their way here to be workers, they were doing it as what were known as the picture brides, sending their pictures to America, kind of a mail-order bride thing. Americans would look at the picture and essentially order a bride. And the bride would be brought to America to marry the guy and off to happily ever after. But despite all of this, the Japanese are often segregated and discriminated against by other workers and farmers who pressed President Teddy Roosevelt for immigration restrictions against the Japanese. Now, the result of this was Teddy Roosevelt meeting with the Japanese government and coming up with the Gentleman's Agreement of 1908. During the Gentleman's Agreement, the Japanese government agreed to limit Japanese immigration to the United States. And by 1913, Japanese immigrants were denied the right to own land in California by the California state government, even if they were already living there. Some of them were even forced to sell their businesses. But the most difficult aspect that took place during this time happened during World War II. And that was Executive Order 9066. Now, many people had been calling for this. They were worried that the Japanese in America would be spies for the Japanese cause. So the American government felt like that it was right and just to put them in internment camps, using Executive Order 9066 to do so. This order said if you're of Japanese ancestry, you have to leave your homes, you have to pack your belongings, and get put on a train under armed guard to basically be relocated. Now, this was not an easy process for Japanese immigrants. I mean, they considered themselves American, and they felt like this was a major civil rights violation of them as Americans. They were proud to be Americans. And they didn't want to be considered as potential threats to America or disloyal. They wanted to be considered loyal Americans. Well, when it was all said and done, they were relocated, and you can see a series of camps here. The most famous one is probably Heart Mountain up in Wyoming, which had 10,000 people. But as far east as Arkansas, there are camps with 8,000 Japanese that are staying there. 13,000 at Gila River in Arizona, and at Poston in Arizona as well. Most of the camps, Tula Lake up in Northern California, had anywhere from 8,000 to 18,000 staying there at a time. And in the camps, you basically found a series of barracks that were pretty expansive. I mean, this is basically a minor city. Now, I want to be sure about one thing here. I don't want people to have the impression that these were like the camps of Adolf Hitler, where they were malnourished and things like that. The camp conditions were about as pleasant as could be made under the circumstances, I guess. The Japanese were clothed and well fed and looked after with medical attention. And this was not an effort to wipe out the Japanese population. It was, however, a pretty large restriction on their civil rights, and that raised a big question. Is it okay to take away some groups' civil rights in order to protect the national security of the country? Most would argue that it didn't need to be protected from the Japanese. Matter of fact, Japanese Americans fighting in military units in World War II were some of the most decorated of the war. So the question remained, do we, even today, this is a legacy that sticks with us now when you look at things like 9/11 and the Patriot Act and airport security that we have now, is it acceptable to violate American civil liberties if it means more protection for the country? It's a question we want to raise in class at some point. Okay, thanks a lot.